So yeah, if you don't remember, Greg spoke earlier. He is the founder and CEO of Foundation Group, also one of our sponsors today. And he is licensed as an enrolled agent tax specialist by the IRS and is an expert on tax exemption and compliance issues for nonprofits. So I will paste in the Foundation Group URL so you can keep up with them. And also, yeah, so here we have how to stay compliant with Greg. So thank you, and take it away.
All right. Well, I'm glad to be back. It was fun to do the conference session this morning on starting a nonprofit. So glad to be able to come back around and talk about something that is really critical to what a lot of the attendees are working on. And I do a conference similar to this each year with a fundraising consultant friend of mine. And she always has a joke of introducing me or a member of our staff as the fun suckers. And we're very quick to point out that no, we're actually the fun facilitators, because if you don't get a lot of this stuff right, you're going to have a hard time raising the money that you want to raise. So let me go ahead and share my screen here. And let's see, the right slide. All right, and we'll get underway. This session is called Charitable Solicitation Registration. And IRS Form 990 is not in this. I did not get the slide deck updated on the name there. I got everything else updated, so I missed that. So my apologies. But we are talking about charitable solicitation registration in this session. And we'll start off just by defining what it is that we're talking about. So what is charitable solicitation? You're often going to hear this called fundraising registration. And it really is sort of the same thing, but it's a licensing and registration structure. That's a regulatory structure that is required of nonprofits in order for them to solicit donations from the public. And this is something that's administered exclusively at the state level. So the IRS doesn't get involved in your fundraising activities per se. Now they're going to be interested to know that you're doing things as far as your money flow the right way. Obviously the IRS does care. But the IRS doesn't require any type of registration in order to raise money from the public other than your 501c3 status. But about 40 states and the District of Columbia have a much different idea. They want you to be registered with them in order to be able to raise money in their state. And we're going to talk about through this session what the definition of solicitation is, because I think it's going to be a little different than a lot of people think, and just what it means to actually go through this process of getting registered and getting legal. Now, I mentioned that there are states that don't have a registration requirement. The 40 states plus DC happen to have that. So you can see on the slide here, we've got a few: Louisiana, Indiana, Vermont, Delaware, Iowa, Montana, Idaho. There's a few that don't have any type of registration process at all, which means there's no restrictions on your ability as a 501c3 to raise money in those states. But that is an exception. And I'm not exactly sure what the dot out off the coast of South Carolina is, but that's not a free state. So the thing about registering to solicit or to raise money is the requirements are determined on a state-by-state basis. And this is really probably the thing that makes registration for fundraising the most difficult, is because no state does it the same way. Some states are going to be an online registration process only. Some states are a paper registration only. It's an actual physical form that you fill out and mail in. More and more states are moving to online, but not all of them are there. Some states offer both. You can do it one way or do it the other. Most states, when you initially register and when you have subsequent reporting, they're going to want detailed financial reports. And sometimes that just consists of your Form 990, and other times a copy of your Form 990, and other times that's going to be some other form of reporting, but they're going to want detailed information about the financial transactions of the organization. And many states actually require that an organization have a CPA audit if gross revenue is above a certain threshold. Foundation Group happens to be located in Nashville, Tennessee. We work with clients all over the country, but for our clients that are in the state of Tennessee, our state has a $500,000 gross revenue threshold, and that's a very common threshold across the country. And if you have gross revenue above that line, above that amount, then you're going to be required to have a CPA firm do a full-blown audit of your organization. And so that's a pretty big deal. It can be expensive to have a a firm come in and do that. And a lot of organizations that are above that threshold don't realize that they're under that type of liability. But that is something that has to be kept in mind. And another thing that makes it challenging is a lot of times the state regulations aren't mirroring what the federal requirements are. So I'll give you an example of that. In the state of Massachusetts, well, let me step back a moment. The IRS, if you already have a 501c3 and you're filing Form 990, you probably know that if you have under $50,000 in revenue, gross revenue, you're able to file a Form 990N, which the IRS calls the e-postcard. You just go online, say how much your, or just attest that your gross revenue was under $50,000, state the name of the contact person of the organization and hit submit. That's basically your Form 990 for the year. So that's a $50,000 gross revenue threshold. Some states like Massachusetts, their regulations are a little bit different. Even if you have as little as $5,000 in gross revenue, in order to register to solicit in Massachusetts, you've got to submit at least a copy of Form 990EZ. So it is 10 times less of a threshold than what the federal requirements are. And you can imagine, and we've had clients in this situation, maybe in an initial year, where they literally had less than $10,000 in revenue, but yet had to go through the expense of having a full Form 990 prepared so that it could be filed along with their fundraising registration. So there's a lot that goes into figuring out even what an organization's liability is. So let's talk about the registration requirements. Again, it's all over the map and it varies from state to state. The one thing that is common across the country is that in most states, they're going to require that you have 501c3 status prior to registering to solicit. There's a handful of states that will allow registration prior to getting an IRS determination letter, but most don't. In fact, and I'll say even here in Tennessee, the regulations pretty much state that you have to have a determination letter, but the Department of Solicitations will often entertain an application for registration prior to IRS determination. That's very much an exception. It's not guaranteed. Most states are going to require that you have that approval letter from the IRS. Virtually all of these states, regardless of whether they'll give you a registration prior to 501c3 status or not, virtually all of them expect registration prior to soliciting the public for contributions in any form or fashion. And that's a very key point. And it's one of the things that we run into the most is organizations that, they're frustrated because they've got donors ready to give, or they've got a campaign or a big fundraising event they're wanting to do. You need to be really careful about that and know what your state's requiring. So the question then comes up, is registration required of all nonprofits? Well, again, this is something that's going to vary from state to state. Some states allow for exemptions based on gross revenue. So maybe a particular state says until you have this much in gross revenue, you're not required to register. Some are going to allow for exceptions to registration based on your charitable purpose. Some states don't require religious organizations to register or churches to register. Sometimes it's going to be on the type of revenue, contributions versus program revenue. That's not so much the case anymore. We're going to talk about that. And even states that allow you to be quote unquote exempt from registration requirements, even most of them are going to require an initial registration to be, this is funny, but they require a registration to be exempt from registration. And really what they're saying is, we need you to register so that we recognize you're below our threshold so that we don't require an annual renewal for that. So even if you're exempt, there's probably something that needs to be done. So that's an important point to keep in mind. Another question that comes up is registration one and done? Well, all states that have a registration system do require some type of renewal. And in the vast majority of states, this is going to be an annual renewal. And there's a couple of places, I think Georgia is one that's got a biannual renewal. The interesting thing about it is it sounds like, okay, you go through this rather lengthy registration process. The renewal process is going to be a lot shorter. Actually, it's not. In most cases, the renewal process is exactly identical to what the registration process was. The same forms, the same financial reports, potentially audited, copies of Form 990. So all of that pretty much stays the same on the annual renewal. So it is definitely not a one and done. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about what activities are considered solicitations. And what's interesting here is years ago, Foundation Group has been working with charitable solicitation registrations for over 20 years. And when we first got started providing services in this area, the compliance level across the country from nonprofits was terrible. You probably had less than 10% of nonprofits nationwide that were even properly registered in their own state. That has changed dramatically over the years, mainly because enforcement has changed. A lot of the states, the enforcement was very weak. There wasn't a lot of visibility that the states had. And so enforcement wasn't a big deal. Well, they also, back in the day, a lot of these states actually bothered trying to parse what was solicitation and what wasn't. And they made a distinction between what was solicited revenue and what was revenue generated from activities. Well, that's not so much true anymore. So I want to kind of go through and take a look at which revenue generating activities are considered solicitations for registration purposes. Well, I think there's some that are going to be quite obvious. And when you think about a fundraising event, so you're going to do a golf tournament, you're going to do some type of fundraising dinner or a silent auction, any number of big event type situations. So you've got a benefit concert, whatever it may be. Well, that's an obvious fundraising activity. Makes sense that you're going to need to be registered in order to conduct something like that. Something similar might be a direct mail campaign. So you're going to do a snail mail campaign to a target list of 1,000 potential contributors. Maybe you're going to do something similar with an email campaign. You've purchased a list, or you've harvested a list through your website, and so you're going to reach out to this group of people, trying to get them to financially support your organization. Well, I feel like those are pretty obvious activities that people would say, yeah, I get that. I can see where we need to register for that. And that used to be pretty much where it ended. Anything other than these type categories, for the most part, a lot of times the states would consider activity other than this to not be soliciting activity. That's really changed. Some less obvious things that are now considered solicitation are one-on-one asks. So I'm a key individual in a nonprofit, I'm a founder, I'm a development director, whoever I may be. Well, I'm going around and I'm having conversations with people I know, people of means, people that I think would be interested in contributing to my organization, but these are just conversations that I'm having. These are one-on-one conversations. Well, that is actually considered a solicitation. Having a website with a donate now button on it, that is also considered a solicitation. Even though it's somewhat passive, it is considered a solicitation. And we're going to talk about the electronic side of this in just a minute. But these are all examples of things that the states really don't bother to parse out anymore. They're considering all these things to be solicitation activities. And probably the least obvious are some things like these. So unsolicited donations. So let's say that Bob in Arizona finds out what Sue in Georgia is doing somehow. Wasn't anything direct that Sue did, but Bob in Arizona finds out about it, loves what the program is, loves the mission, sends $1,000 to Sue's organization. I mean, that's a completely unsolicited donation. So does that count for registration purposes? Well, it may, and it depends on the state. If Bob were in California, absolutely. 1 penny of revenue sourced from the state of California is the equivalent of solicitation, even if you didn't ask for it. So again, it goes back to that patchwork of rules across the states. Another thing that's less obvious, or among the least obvious, is going to be program revenue from sales of product or services. So let's say that you're a performing arts charity and you're selling tickets at the door for your productions. Or let's say you're a youth baseball organization and you're charging a participation fee to the families of the kids that are participating in your baseball activities. Well, those are actually considered solicitations now. Participation fees, membership dues. A lot of these states, the majority of these states even, are considering membership dues to be solicited revenue. I think the easiest way to look at it now is the states are basically saying, we're not going to parse this anymore. We don't have time, we don't have the resources, we don't have the manpower to try to figure out if what you're telling us is a fact. Basically, if you're raising money, we're considering every form of revenue generation to be a soft solicitation. And so these states that are part of the 40 plus DC that have a registration requirement are looking for those registration applications. So let's take a look at the risks and penalties. The question often comes up, how is the state going to know? And really, what is the risk to me? I just formed my nonprofit a few months ago. I don't have status yet, but I've got this big event coming up and I can't cancel it. We're well invested in this. What happens? Well, what are the risks and penalties associated with noncompliance? Well, at a minimum, it's embarrassment. And at worst, it could be significant fines and penalties. And often it's both. I remember one of the examples that I often use is about 6 or 7 years ago. I happened to be walking by the television in our family room during the late evening news, local evening news. And I just happened to notice as I walked by, it just caught my attention because the news anchor above her shoulder was the logo of a veterans organization that we had just recently picked up as a client. And it was a local Nashville veterans charity. And the news story was that the state of Tennessee, their charities division, had fined this organization $25,000, $5,000 each for 5 separate violations of the solicitation registration rules. Now, they had just hired us knowing that they needed to get some things straightened out. So they hadn't been a client but a few days. And for some reason, in this particular case, I had gotten pulled into the sales call. So I was aware of them, aware of their situation, couldn't believe that they were on the news. And what had happened is they had been advertising an upcoming large fundraiser, and someone had reported this as a non-compliant organization to the state of Tennessee. State of Tennessee filed or assessed the penalties rather, and they ended up on the news. Well, the good news is we were able to get it all straightened out. We got everything worked out for them. They never ended up paying a penalty at all to the state of Tennessee, which was great. But do you think that the news organization went back and did a follow-up story to let all of their viewers know that this organization got their act straight? Well, they didn't. So this organization definitely suffered the embarrassment. Their event had to be canceled. So there is a reason that you want to be compliant on these things. It is possible the states can also enjoin you or prevent you from conducting activities. We had a client in Minnesota that came to us after this had already happened to them. They got penalized and prohibited from conducting any fundraising activity in the state until they got everything straightened out. In some states, once you're penalized, even if you get things worked out, they don't even allow you to throw yourself on their mercy. South Carolina has written into their legislation that penalty abatement is not possible. So if you get assessed a penalty, you will ultimately have to figure out a way to get it paid. So one of the things that we're asked is why has the enforcement gotten to be such a big deal now compared to what it was? Well, part of it is data walls are coming down. And that's the walls of separation between, say, the corporations division and the division of charities. A lot of times you would have many thousands of incorporated nonprofits in a state and hundreds of organizations registered, and those two agencies couldn't see each other's data. Well, that's not true anymore. And public awareness that nonprofits should be registered. So donors are aware that nonprofits should be registered and often look up to see if you are. And over the last few years, the IRS has really kind of reduced their scrutiny of some smaller nonprofits, and the states have had to pick up the slack and really beefed up the enforcement on charitable solicitations. So the question that is always on everybody's mind is online donations. And so we've got to talk about that because everybody wants to do it, needs to do it. It's become an essential component of your fundraising activity. So how does that play in with these registration requirements? Well, there is a such thing called the Charleston Principles. And this was a set of guidelines that was put together in 2001 by most of the attorneys general around the country to deal with digital giving. Now, I didn't misspeak when I said 2001. It was that long ago. They're heavily outdated, but they still are in play. Now, they are not binding rules, but they are guidelines that most of the states adopt. So online donation capability does not necessarily mean you've got a nationwide registration requirement. So if you've got a website that everybody in the country can see and you have a donate now button, the one thing you need to do, according to the Charleston Principles, is you need to be registered in your state of incorporation. That will give you a safe harbor for most of the other states. The thing is, the other states become a multi-state registration situation when that unsolicited donation is followed up by an ask. So let's go back to Bob. Bob's in Arizona. Bob gives the gift of $1,000 to Sue in Georgia. Sue responds with a thank you and says, we'd love to have you donate again. You've just solicited Bob at this point and probably triggered a registration requirement in Arizona. As I mentioned earlier, California says if you get money from us, you got to register here no matter what. So that brings us to the last part of this, which is multi-state registration. What is multi-state registration? Well, the states, again, wide-ranging, conflicting requirements. It often depends on the activity in that state, and you may not have to register in as many states as it appears. We fully believe that there is as much danger in over-registration as there is under-registration. You end up having to deal with a lot of red tape and compliance, maybe for states that you don't have to. So working with somebody that knows how to evaluate your actual liability is pretty important. Some states are going to require your corporation to register as a foreign state corporation and get a certificate of authority in addition to registering for solicitations. Not all have that. And multi-state fundraising significantly raises compliance burden. We have dozens and dozens and dozens of clients that have to be registered in all states, and there's just a lot to deal with on that. So how can you stay compliant? Well, register in your state of incorporation as soon as you can. It's the first location of compliance responsibility, and it really opens the door to allow online solicitation, which is really what you want to do. And consider relying on a trusted service provider. A shameless plug, but we can definitely help with that. We deal with organizations all over the country on this. As mentioned earlier, we are here for anybody's nonprofit formation needs, Form 990 preparation, full service bookkeeping. We've even got a membership program that bundles some of these services for compliance, and we'd be here definitely happy to talk with you. Our website's easy to remember. It's 501c3.org. So I'm going to stop sharing on this and
awesome. Thank you
turn it
so
back
much.
to Jenna.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Greg. We have a few questions. I think we have some time, a couple minutes to go through them. Let me pull some out. So someone asked, if we hold fundraising events in multiple states, do we have to register in all of those states?
Probably. Unless they fall into one of those 10 states that don't have a registration requirement. And some states are weird. Texas has a registration requirement, but only if you're a law enforcement charity. So they're kind of odd, but the vast majority of those 40 locations, if you're doing an event in that state, you will need to be registered with their division of charities.
And what is the timing of each state solicitation filing? Or where can you go for us to direct?
The timing, I don't know if they mean how long it takes or when they can do it. The when really depends on the state. Again, like I mentioned earlier, some states will let you do it before your 501c3 approved. Some states make you have your 501c3 status in advance. The timing really depends on backlog. Some states can turn your paperwork around in a few weeks. The state of Illinois is so backed up, they're taking almost 2 years to approve a registration. In fact, Illinois tells you go ahead and pay the penalty in advance because you're not going to get approved before your event, no matter what. That's how crazy it can be from place to place.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. Jess says, do NGOs have any different requirements?
NGO, I would presume she's talking about a foreign organization. That's really that's going to be even more granular of an answer. I'd have to know more about that situation to be able to answer that.
Yeah, so Jess, I guess if you want to type in more information there. Is there a difference if the solicitation is in kind versus funds?
Not really. Most states are going to recognize in-kind solicitations to be the equivalent of cash. If you're asking anybody to give something that they could potentially get tax deductibility for in in-kind gifts, they can do that. The states are going to recognize that as a solicitation.
Are the rules any different for soliciting corporate sponsorships versus individuals?
Great question. No, there's not a difference.
Great answer. What is the typical fee to register for a state? Is this a one-time registration fee, or most states are annual fees?
Most states have an annual fee. That of all the fees an organization is going to pay, that tends to be the lowest. Most states are going to be, I'd have to go back to my compliance director for the exact numbers because it's all over the map. But most states, the annual fee is going to be under $200. In a lot of states, it's well under $100. They just want the information in most cases. They just want the report and the registration renewal.
Okay, great. Well, Greg, you have been a wealth of information to us today, and sorry, we're running over a little bit. So I just want to be sure, good on time here. If you want to reach out to Greg, you have his email in the chat. Also, we will put the foundation group's website again. It's just 501c3.org. And thank you again so much, Greg.
You're welcome.
It's been wonderful. And thank you for being a sponsor, Foundation Group.
Glad to do it.
Thanks so much, Greg. There was one last question. Does the Foundation Group offer a service to register in the different states?
We do. They just need to, if they go to 501c3.org and look under our compliance services, one of them that's listed is charitable solicitation registration. And Brenda on our team would be happy to talk to someone about that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Greg.
You bet. Thank you.
This has been fantastic. Awesome. So, wow. What a great session. What a great summit so far. It's still going. We're still here. Thank you all for being here. This has been so much fun.